Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for coming to campus on this rainy winter day in which we'll have to find our own way to warm our hearts. For those who don't know me, my name is Alain Bresson. I am the chair of the Department of Classics. My great honor to welcome you to the Sigmund H. Danziger Junior Distinguished Lecture in the Humanities, with the Walsh Lecture earlier in the year, the Danziger Lecture, one of the two most prestigious events in the calendar of the Classics Department. In the recent past, we have had a series of prominent lecturers, like 2 years ago, Brian Rose, who talked about wars between East and West, ancient Troy, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And last year, Julia Annas, who presented a lecture on Plato's Ideal Society in Utopia. Our guest of today, John Hamilton, is professor of comparative literature at Harvard, but also a talented musician. My colleague Michele Lowrie is professor in the Department of Classics in the college. It's a pleasure to tell you more about our distinguished colleague.
So it is a very special pleasure for me to introduce John Hamilton, this year's speaker for the Sigmund H. Danziger Memorial Lecture. John is now an illustrious professor of comparative literature at Harvard, but I first got to know him when he was a graduate student at NYU, also in comparative literature, when he was engaged in research on Pindar and his reception, which he wrote his dissertation about, and it focused on productive incomprehensibility. And the book has since been published with Harvard University Press as Soliciting Darkness, Pindar, Obscurity, and the Classical Tradition. John explores the struggle between those who valorize making sense of this difficult poetry in its own historical context, such as Wilamowitz tried to do, and those such as Nietzsche and the Georgikreis, who would recuperate the past not for mere understanding, but as a tool for self-discovery. I can attest that at his dissertation defense, it was not at all obscure that he would become a great light in the field of literary studies. And it is with pride that I can say that he fulfills in an exemplary way the injunction that the speaker of the Danziger Lecture be an established scholar who has been exceptionally skilled at inspiring an appreciation for classical literature. Now, I'm accustomed to speaking to John as a classicist, but not just me being the classicist, but John being the classicist. And it was only after a while that I began to notice that scholars in French, English, and Renaissance studies are also accustomed to speaking to him as a full-fledged member of their field. All this in addition to his major field of German literature. John has a disconcerting habit of remembering what one wrote way back when better than one remembers oneself. But it is not just in literary studies that John has made his mark. Before returning to formal education, John had a separate career as a rock musician in a band called Tiny Lights. His book, Music, Madness, and the Unworking of Language with Columbia University Press, attests to his continuing commitment to music and to the history of thinking about it, particularly as a cultural medium whose meaning beyond sense-making causes a crisis of representation for language and therefore has a history of association with madness. Again, he explores the limits of comprehensibility. Most recently, his work has taken a political turn. His book, just out last year from Princeton, Security, Politics, Humanity, and the Philology of Care, starts with the Roman origins of security in Securitas, backtracks to Greek asphaleia, then arcs through Renaissance allegorization, Luther, Leibniz, the French Encyclopédie, Nietzsche, to name just a few of the many thinkers treated in this amazing work, up to modern security studies. The paradox of security, a state of lacking care, say cura, sets up a double bind between being carefree and being careless. John resists the degradation that comes with a governmental monopolization of security measures and proposes instead a flexible, more humane politics. I cannot do better than to quote him on his method. Okay, and he says, with its responsibility to the historical alterations within the gift that is language, philology, slowly, humbly, and carefully, that is cum cura, may provide a privileged means for holding determinations at bay, for perpetuating community and its constitutive communication, not by fixing a word's properties conceptually, with sovereign authority, disciplinary control, or tired complacency, but rather by pursuing its transit through time and across culture, and thereby allowing it to be translated over and over again on the basis of its very untranslatability. With this afternoon's lecture, John will address once again a concern at the heart of philology, namely the allusion to ancient poetry and scripture as authorities, and will show us how different practices of citation can reveal an author's underlying theories of language, history, and cognition. His title is Repetitio Sententiarum, Repetitio Verborum, Kant, Hamann, and the Implications of Citation. I welcome John Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Michele. Thank you, Alain. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm very grateful for the invitation, for the kind words. I apologize beforehand if I test the limits of your comprehensibility this afternoon, and I appreciate your coming here. Everyone has a handout, and I'll be referring to that. I'll read my very literal English translation, but you could follow along in the original German, Latin, Greek, etc. I wanted to prepare a talk that essentially examined various methods of dealing with citationality, why citations are used, but also more importantly, how they are used by different writers. And I chose Kant and Hamann because of their close association, their plans to work together in and around 1759, and the curious example of a citation from Horace that both put to varied purposes. So I'll just begin, and we'll be looking at the opening of Kant's essay answering the question, what is enlightenment? Was ist Aufklärung? So in addition to providing one of the most important and memorable definitions of the European Enlightenment, this opening paragraph of Immanuel Kant's response to the question, was ist Aufklärung? What is enlightenment? From 1784, broaches crucial issues regarding the form and function of citations in philosophical discourse. And I'll just read from the first paragraph, again in the English. Enlightenment is man's exit from his self-incurred immaturity, Unmündigkeit. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. Sapere aude, have courage to use your own understanding, is therefore the motto, der Wahlspruch, of the Enlightenment. Kant's decision to appropriate a tagline from Horace's epistles is at the very least intriguing. Despite the call to apply one's understanding, quote, without the guidance of another, ohne Leitung eines anderen, a qualification that Kant apparently feels compelled to repeat twice, verbatim, he allows philosophy to be guided by a classical citation, sapere aude. The resolution to be intellectually self-sufficient, to abandon one's self-incurred immaturity, is expressed by borrowing a phrase from a poet. The exhortation to think for oneself is prescribed by an external source. The courageous independence of one's intellect is shown to be strikingly dependent. A plea for autonomy, for release from tutelage, a plea for authenticity curiously relies still on prior authority. Without blinking, Kant emerges from the condition of immaturity or Unmündigkeit, relinquishing the position of an underage child who has no voice or mouth, no Mund, and he does so by becoming a mouthpiece of poetic tradition, or even by allowing tradition to speak for him. Here, in a text that explicitly challenges the institutions and authorities of church and state, which act as Vormünder, as advocates who dare to speak in the people's stead. And I refer to the second paragraph, 1b. That by far the greatest part of mankind, including the entire fair sex, should consider the step toward maturity, Mündigkeit, not only as difficult, but also as highly dangerous. Those guardians, those Vormünder, already take care of it, they who have kindly taken upon themselves the task of supervision. Powerful institutions infantilize the populace by portraying independent thinking as something highly precarious and frightening. They strive to convince society that entrance into self-reliance should be restricted to those accompanied by a legal guardian. In Kant's rating system, too, enlightenment is decidedly for mature audiences only. However, what distinguishes the philosopher's project is a desire to encourage every citizen to grow up, to examine, judge, and speak for oneself. And I'll just loosely refer to paragraph 1c here. Thus, Kant rails against the laziness and cowardice, the Faulheit und Feigheit, that causes the majority to remain immature, unmündig bleiben, long after they have naturally come of age. Nonetheless, as already indicated, Kant does not hesitate to import language from another source. He not only cites natural law, naturaliter maiorenes, but also, more emphatically, he cites a poet, this time without protective parentheses. He lets Horace be his spokesman, even if only in passing. With one hand, Kant decries the rules and formulas, the Satzungen und Formeln, that mechanically operate as the footcuffs of perpetual immaturity, die Fußschellen einer immerwährenden Unmündigkeit, while with the other hand he cites a poetic formula, implicitly footnoted, making it moreover into the slogan of autonomy, into the very motto of the Enlightenment, seemingly unaware of any contradiction or irony. All the same, it really should come as no surprise that Kant expresses even the notion of intellectual independence by means of a Latin quotation. Since antiquity, thinkers have been drawn to the pithy utterance, the concise maxim, the well-coined phrase. Modern writers from the Renaissance of Machiavelli and Montaigne, straight through to Kant's 18th century and beyond, inherited the ancients' inclination to harvest key insights, precepts, and viewpoints from the poetic tradition, not out of laziness, not out of cowardice, but rather in order to communicate their own positions with concision and cogency. For Quintilian, there is an obvious authoritative value in the maxims of poets, the Sententiae Poetarum, and here citation 2 on the next page. For not only are speeches full of maxims from the poets, but also the books of philosophers who, though they believe everything to be inferior to their own precepts and writings, have not disdained to draw on, repetere, the authority from great numbers of verses. Poetic turns of phrase lend authority to philosophical disquisitions. Even those thinkers most skeptical of public opinion were captivated by the forcefulness of the apothegm, the proverb, and the gnomic utterance, appreciating their potential contribution to thoughtful reflection. In Plato's Protagoras, for instance, Socrates expresses admiration for the Spartans' capacity to philosophize, citation 3. For if anyone is willing to associate with the most ordinary Lacedaemonian, he will find him, for the most part, to appear ordinary in his speech. But then, by chance, at some point in the conversation, all at once, like a skillful lancer, he hurls forth a valuable remark, brief and condensed, so that his interlocutor appears no better than a child. Socrates goes on to attribute to Spartan ingenuity the seminal maxims of know thyself and nothing in excess, the famous maxims that were inscribed on the temple to Apollo at Delphi, in order to demonstrate how the first philosophers exhibited this laconic brevity, this brachologia laconicae. Kant's nomination of sape aude belongs precisely to this venerable tradition, of appropriating the efficacy of a succinct dictum. Indeed, how better to emerge from Unmündigkeit than by reducing one's formidable Vormunde to the level of helpless children. Although Kant does not explicitly identify the Horatian source, and here I'm referring back to the opening paragraph of the Enlightenment essay, he could count on his readership to recognize the line. His usage does not necessarily imply dependence, as much as it recalls a notion of authorship that regards the auctor not only as the creator or originator of discourse, but also as the one who preserves prior auctoritas, granting it continued existence or even a kind of permanence by vouching for its veracity or present relevance. By invoking the Latin imperative sapere aude, Kant can hardly be charged with dogmatism. On the contrary, he strives to reveal a fundamental universal trait of human intellectual courage, reminding his readers of what Horace already knew, hoping to reawaken a spirit of independent inquiry that is otherwise silenced by the church, by the state, and by other oppressive institutions. Against these intimidating sovereigns, Kant enlists Horace to marshal a counterforce, to inspire intellectual self-sufficiency and autonomy. The philosopher, therefore, does not succumb to power as much as he draws it to his side. And this alignment of power entails reciprocal effects. In the course of legitimizing his own discourse by means of citation, Kant also establishes Horace's legitimacy for the Enlightenment. That is, we are dealing with a transference and maintenance of power, one that confirms the authority cited while empowering the author who cites. This conjoined power enhances philosophical presentation and has consistently contributed to its clout and validity. As Aristotle notes in his Metaphysics, quotation is one of the three viable methods for granting a discourse currency, which subsidizes its project for convincing audiences and readers. Citation 4. Some people do not accept statements unless you express them mathematically, others unless by way of examples, while others deem that one call in a poet as a witness. Along with mathematical proofs and paradigmatic illustrations, poetic quotations find their place in ancient philosophical discussions precisely as items that recipients deem valuable, axiousin, like the valuable remark, the rema axion, that Socrates found so impressive among the Spartans. Should a philosopher strive to ascertain and impart knowledge, he would be expected to deal directly with this anterior body of Sophia, the one displayed by the poets. Accordingly, for an audience steeped in poetic culture, it is worthwhile to summon a poet's voice, either for points of verification or for points of contestation. Aristotle's verb for invoking, introducing, or calling in, epagestai, a term almost perfectly replicated in the modern German anführen, engages the metaphor of calling someone in as a witness before a judging party, of summoning a person in court to provide testimony. The juridical image is further operative in the Latin citare, which is composed from the perfect passive participle of ciere, to cause to move, to stir, to drive, or to shake. And it's also, of course, cognate with the Greek kinein, to put in motion. A passage cited is a passage that has been called to appear, made to move from one context to another, perhaps even shaken loose from its initial setting. Yet this kinetic energy is not always amenable to control. The citation as attestant, as testifier, always stands in a position to become a hostile witness. This possibility is grounded in the fact that the testimony adduced by citation can never be entirely absorbed by the new incorporating text. In addition to the synchronic axis, how the citation refers to the present discourse, there is also, of course, the diachronic axis, how the citing text relates back to the cited discourse. And the energy that is ignited by the friction between the synchronic and the diachronic, between repetition and difference, derivation and innovation, also stands to disrupt the adoptive context. In Kant's essay, the Aufklärung essay, the potential disruption is signaled by the verbal intrusion of the citation, which is both lexically and typographically marked. In hitting upon the italicized phrase sapere aude, the person who reads Kant's piece encounters an opening that leads away from the text at hand and toward prior sources. Needless to say, the first step onto this intellitextual path would be to consult, with or without Kant's sanction, the second poem from Horace's first book of epistles. Here, the poet attempts to persuade Lollius Maximus, a young student of rhetoric, to devote himself to the Homeric poems as a repository of moral, philosophical precepts. Rather than waste one's youth on the pursuit of wealth and pleasure, like Penelope's suitors, one should devote serious time to studying the principles of virtue and wisdom by way of exemplary poetry before it is too late. And this is citation 5 from the epistles. The medium facti qui coipit habet, he who begins has half the deed done. Sapere aude, dare to be wise. Begin. He who postpones the hour of living rightly is like the farmer who waits for the river to run off. But the river flows past and will flow, rolling along for all time. Horace's eminently quotable bid, sapere aude, itself follows on the heels of proverbial wisdom, de medium facti qui coipit habet, which translates the Greek adage, arche de toi hemisu pantos, an utterance that would continue its career in most European languages. For instance, in French, les bien avancés, qui a bien commencé, the German, frisch gewagtes hab gewonnen, my tongue is going to fall apart, I think, or the English, let's see if I can do the English, once begun is half done. In Horace's epistle, it is this gnomic keenness that characterizes the poet's advice as especially paternal and direct. Returning to Kant's usage, then, what the initial poetic context reveals is that sapere aude should be understood in a moral and not a cognitive sense. In Horace's poem, the command refers to the careful study of epic poetry and not, as Kant implies, a resolute rejection of dogmatic guidance. Kant's exhortation, calling for the intellectual emancipation from the guidance of another, contrasts with Horace's initial recommendation, which promotes Homer as the moral advisor of virtue. It is noteworthy that Horace suggests the reading of poetry and not philosophy for moral instruction. Although both Horace and Kant allude to the hesitation and childishness, the philosopher's admonition, dare to know, dare to have the courage to use your own understanding, is addressed to someone who lacks scientific curiosity, while Horace's encouragement, dare to study true wisdom, is aimed at the hedonistic procrastinator who, like a foolish rustic, refuses to cross the river until the waters run dry. In summoning the phrase and calling it to witness, this phrase, sapere aude, Kant may have been motivated by Pierre Gassendi, who, a century earlier, had already refitted Horace's admonition to express a modern appeal for free inquiry. Gassendi, who imprinted all his books with the Horatian line, enlisted the phrase to argue explicitly against virtue, which the scientist regarded as conformity to a norm. For Gassendi, himself a precursor of the Enlightenment, sapere aude should inspire the boldness required for the fearless application of critical reason. The same intention is discernible in an earlier text that Kant published a year before the Aufklärung essay, namely his prolegomena to any future metaphysics, which also includes a reference to Horace's epistle. And here I'll be referring lightly, I won't quote it exactly, number 6. In these introductory pages, Kant addresses philosophers who have hitherto been reluctant to pose the simple question, quote, whether such a thing as metaphysics is at all possible. According to Kant, the reason why philosophers have hesitated to ask this fundamental question is because by inquiring into the possibility of metaphysics, into the possibility of a science, one implicitly doubts its actuality. For Kant, this sheepishness is yet another instance of the cowardice that obstructs the establishment and elaboration of sound metaphysics. The, quote, reader who thinks for himself, der selbstdenkende Leser, must not cower in apprehension, for the demand to form the foundations of any future metaphysics will not disappear merely by neglecting to cross the treacherous waters of doubt. And to illustrate his point, Kant appends a footnote that simply cites the simile from Horace's epistle, rusticus expectat, etc. In essence, Kant uses Horace's words to express his own ideas. He employs Horace's utterance without full regard for the initial act of utterance. The énonciation is subordinated to or dissolves into the énoncé. This citational procedure is necessary for Kant's mode of philosophizing insofar as it reduces the intrusion of the quoted text to a minimum. A reader may or may not stammer at the sudden appearance of a poetic quotation in Kant's philosophical exposition. The point is that this reader is expected to move past the interruption without further ado. For example, to continue reading Kant's essay rather than reaching for Horace's epistles. Kant repeats Horace's language, but it is specifically a repetition of an idea, a repetitio sententiae, an idea, moreover, that Kant himself aims to steer with sovereign control. To this end, the signified, that which is presented as ideational content, must take precedence over the initial form that voiced the signifiers. The vox and its words, the verba, must yield to the thought expressed in the words, or the sententia. Kant is more concerned with communicating a thought than with transmitting the discourse that mediates the thought. Although necessary for transmission, Kant's exposition relies on the principle of the vanishing medium. Once the idea is received, the discourse itself is dispensable. A writer who is simply content to repeat words, a writer who is content to insert into his or her text a repetitio verborum, is as foolish as an underage child or a farmer waiting for the river to drain out. And it is precisely this kind of foolishness or childishness that we discover in the work of Kant's fellow neighbor in Königsberg, his rather difficult friend, Johann Georg Hamann. Hamann's writings, which are generally regarded as documents of a counter-enlightenment, are indeed notoriously obscure, dense and abstruse, at once pious and humorous, ironic and bawdy, perplexingly digressive, and saturated with countless allusions and citations from the Bible, from Greco-Roman antiquity, and from European letters. As Goethe famously quipped, when reading Hamann, quote, one must completely rule out what one normally means by understanding, end quote. The difficulty of Hamann's work may be explained by his refusal to follow the principle of the vanishing medium. For Hamann, discourse, which is absolutely bound to a unique historical and cultural context, is never dispensable. The words of the discourse, that is, the concrete verba, possess value in themselves. Hamann's writings are replete with citations because citations are examples of language that are not exhausted in their original enunciation. They persist beyond their initial purpose, having broken free of the primary communication while still retaining the qualities of their provenance. The liberation from and continuation of the first communicative context is the earmark of poetic discourse, which is thereby distinguished from ordinary speech that treats language as a perishable commodity. As we shall see, Hamann's approach reveals a disavowal on Kant's part. Kant cites Horace to lend a certain value to his own discourse, yet he does so by enforcing the dissolution of the poetic medium, a medium that is in fact the very source of the value Kant wishes to exploit. In striving to make his own new thought visible, Kant must render the old initial discursive situation invisible. The fate of Lollius's moral education should have no bearing on Kant's project of enlightenment. In contrast, Hamann insists on savoring the discourse itself, indulging in its depth and its opacity. His starting point is a starting point for every devout Christian. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. Rather than follow the principle of the vanishing medium, Hamann attends to the principal medium, the human verba, which he understands as analogous to the redemptive verbum. I went to Catholic school. I'm sorry, I don't. I do verbum. I can't do verbum. It's just awful. The contrast between Kant's and Hamann's practices of citation is especially vivid in their exchange from 1759 regarding Kant's proposal to collaborate on a physics primer for children, a project that Kant had hoped would lure his friend back to the side of enlightened free thought and thus temper the religious fanaticism that Hamann had been exhibiting since his recent major conversion in London. At first, Kant suggested that Hamann translate portions of Diderot's Encyclopédie, and after Hamann flatly dismissed this proposal, Kant replied with the children's physics project. This time, Hamann's interest was significantly sparked. In his idiosyncratic fashion, Hamann entertains the plan while assuming an altogether playful, whimsical tone, and now we'll be looking at the citations in Group 7. In his very first letter in response to Kant on this proposed children's physics project, before inscribing any greeting, before giving a date, Hamann opens with an epigraph from Horace's Odes 127, and I printed it as Hamann prints it at the head of the letter. Ah, miser, quanta laboras in Charybdi. Ah, wretched one, how much you labor in Charybdis, a boy worthy of a better flame. Hamann, too, shakes some lines out of their initial context to speak to new circumstances. Whereas Horace's ode teases a young man wounded by a disastrous love affair, Hamann applies the verses to lament the vain labors of his philosophical friend, who, he suggests, is being drawn down into horrifying whirlpool of rationalism. The epigraph implies that Kant is the miser puer, the wretched boy who fancies himself old enough to brave the monstrous maelstrom. Yet, unlike Kant's use of citation, which passes over the initial discursive situation, Hamann allows Horace's initial erotic setting to impinge upon and color his present message. Tellingly, when Hamann publishes this letter, he publishes the first two replies to Kant, he titles them specifically as two love letters, Liebesbriefe. That is to say, in contrast to Kant's citational practice, Hamann invites the reader to consult Horace's erotically driven poem. He does not neglect the original énonciation in favor of a more amenable énoncé, but rather allows it to intrude, to cause an interruption, to transform his consideration of a scholarly proposal into a personal love letter. Rather than gloss over the consequences of his citation's provenance, Hamann gives free rein to the ramifications of performing a repetitio verborum. It takes a boy to know one. In starting the letter proper then, and this is citation 7b, Hamann maintains the amorous context while brusquely shifting metaphors, not without sarcasm. Die Göner ihrer Verdienste würden von Mitleiden die Achseln zucken, wenn sie wüssten, dass sie mit einer Kinderphysik schwanger gingen. The benefactors of your merits would shrug their shoulders in pity if they knew that you went about pregnant with a children's physics book. The guiding image, which relates authorship to childbearing, in addition to transfiguring the addressed philosopher from a miserable adolescent to an expectant mother, also alludes to that key philosophical tradition instigated in Plato's Symposium, where Diotima, in her famous account of Eros, distinguishes the two alternate drives for achieving immortality. In Diotima's view, of course, all men are pregnant. Some seek to reproduce corporeally, while others strive to engender virtue and prudence by means of educating the youth, paidein. By portraying Kant as someone pregnant with an educational treatise for children, Hamann either preserves Diotima's distinction between somatic and soulful reproduction, or Hamann cleverly allows both interpretations to converge. The letter, which is long, and I'm only giving you the beginning and the end, eventually reveals Hamann's main point. He points to the difficulty of writing for children, which he claims would require transforming oneself into a child, for only a childish author could communicate in a language understandable by children. Hamann then asks if Kant is truly up to this bold task. Citation 7c. To manage to receive praise from the mouth of children and infants, to take part in this ambition and taste is no ordinary business, which one must begin not by stealing colored feathers, but rather by voluntarily relinquishing all superiority in age and wisdom and renouncing all vanity. A philosophical book for children, therefore, would necessarily appear as simplistic, foolish, and tasteless as a divine book written for human beings. Now test yourself. Do you have enough heart to be the author of a simplistic, foolish, and tasteless theory of nature? Take heart, for then you are also a philosopher for children. Vale et saper aude. Unlike Kant's underage, unmündige cowards, Hamann's children and infants explicitly have a mouth. Is Kant capable of receiving praise aus dem Munde der Kinder, from the mouth of children? Hamann compares the proposed physics book for children to the Christian gospel, that divine book written for human beings. Thus, in considering Kant's proposal, which the philosopher had hoped would rekindle his friend's allegiance to the Enlightenment, Hamann stays true to his religious convictions, resorting to a reflection on the Christian mystery of divine kenosis and incarnation, of God's self-humiliation, of God's loving condescension to mankind. For Hamann, the philosopher who is willing to accommodate his scientific approach to the level of children is analogous to the God who voluntarily descended to a less dignified state, to the God who relinquished his superiority. The proposed project, this children's book of physics, would hardly be a testament to the accomplishments of rational investigation, but rather would appear as simple, foolish, and tasteless, einfältig, töricht und abgeschmackt, as the Christian gospel was initially received. To cite the words from Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, for the Jews a stumbling block, a skandalon, and for the Greeks foolishness, morean. Does Kant have the taste to be so tasteless, the Geschmack to be so abgeschmackt? Certainly this would be no ordinary or common or mean business, kein gemeines Geschäft. Indeed, would Kant dare to savor what common sense finds insipid? Throughout his writings, Hamann repeatedly has recourse to Paul's verse from 1 Corinthians. In fact, they are inscribed on his tombstone in Münster in the Latin Vulgate translation, and I've given you the Vulgate version in section 8. I'll read the English. But we preach Christ crucified, for the Jews a stumbling block and for the Greeks foolishness. But for those who have been called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the strength of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser, sapientius, than men, and weakness of God, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Hamann's closing imperative, lifted from Horace, saper aude, thus provokes Kant to dare to taste, and thereby acknowledge a foolishness that is wiser, sapientius, to dare to convert his mouth to a child's mouth, in brief, to sense in his own mouth a Eucharistic economy of salvation that reason may judge to be immature, while in fact it exhibits an even higher maturity. Hamann frames his letter to Kant with two citations from Horace, who is thus brought in to bear witness to some truth. As we've seen, he begins with an epigraph from Horace's Odes and concludes with a line from Horace's Epistles. Hardly a rustic sap who waits for the river to run off, Kant is obliquely depicted as a lovesick boy who bravely plunges into the whirlpool of rational inquiry. Yet Hamann seems to suggest that although the philosopher struggles with one monster, he neglects to deal with another, perhaps more worthy opponent. Falling between Scylla and Charybdis, Kant is miserable, avoiding one danger while exposing himself to a greater call. In his love letter, Hamann implies that Kant is worthy of a better flame, a love that would shipwreck his reasoned course. Yet is the philosopher ready to swallow this difficult truth? For Hamann, The fact that Kant would propose to write a children's book is encouraging. It inspires his love. For he who begins has half the deed done. From this early exchange with Kant, straight through to the metacritique of purism of reason, also from 1784, Hamann insisted on the messy materiality of language, fully recognizing that every repetitio Senteniarum is necessarily a repetitio Verborum. This insistence is verified by Hegel's assessment, and this is from a famous review that Hegel wrote of Hamann's writings. Hamann's writings do not have a characteristic style so much as they are style through and through. Hegel's emphatic distinction between having and being points to the inseparability of form and content, word and idea, which not only motivates Hamann's use of citation beyond purposes of legitimization or ornamentation, but also corresponds to Hamann's primary article of faith. For Hamann, it is vitally important to regard the Christian incarnation not as mere embodiment or possession, but rather as a perfect coincidence of the divine and the human, ein Gott Mensch. Consistently throughout his writings, Hamann warns against any slippage into Docetism, which distinguishes between the God and the man. Christ did not merely have a human body, he was a human body. Just like ideas do not simply have words to express them, they are words, firmly grounded in historical and cultural situations. And now my conclusion. In Hamann's hands, citation both rests on Trinitarian doctrine and serves as a weapon against what he perceives as the anti-historicist position of the Enlightenment. In his Socratic Memorabilia, partially addressed to Kant and published in 1759, Hamann confesses his faith in the very final paragraph of his treatise. And this is citation 9. If it is true that God himself, as it reads in the good confession which he made before Pilate, if it is true, I say, that God himself became man and came into the world that he might bear witness to the truth, if so, then it would require no omniscience to foresee that he would not escape from the world as well as Socrates, but rather would die a more humiliating and more cruel death than the parasite of that most Christian king, Louis the Beloved, who is a great-grandchild of Louis the Great. And that's how he ends the treatise. There's much that is notable about these concluding lines, which rashly move from Christ's interview with Pilate and the pronouncement of divine condescension to a pair of comparisons that shifts from the expected to the startling. Although it was not uncommon to correlate Socrates' martyrdom with Christ's passion, the subsequent connection to the torture and cruel execution of the would-be assassin Robert François Damiens amounts to an associative tailspin. It is this manner of thinking that Kant would find particularly troubling, an adventurousness that borders on recklessness. Yet for Hamann, linking the crucifixion to a regicide's excruciating persecution forms exactly the kind of coincidence of opposites that Hamann found especially appealing, for it forcefully expresses the conjunction of an antithetical pair that confounds any reasonable abstraction. The same effect obtains here in the stylistic breach that occurs when sublime theological references yield to a rather mundane account of the lineage of Louis XV. The audacious foolishness of Hamann's verbal assemblages testifies to the truth of divine condescension. Indeed, understood specifically as a man who came into the world that he might bear witness to the truth, Christ, as the Word incarnate, as the amalgam of the highest and the basest, the synchronic and the diachronic, is, at least for Hamann, the greatest, most powerful citation of all. Thank you.
Questions?
Glenn, surprise. First question.
Two, actually.
Two. And the second one has 4 parts?
No.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was delightful as always. I have 2 questions. The first one is about the Sapere Aude in Kant. The second is about the quotation from Horace at the beginning of the letter of Hamann.
Right.
You point in their discussion of Breson's Aufklärung to an apparent tension, first of all, between an argument, let's not use authorities, and then the use of authority. And secondly, to Kant's completely misunderstanding or redirecting the Horatian tag. But wouldn't it make a better argument to combine these two and say that Kant knows that he's distorting Hamann, and he's showing you what you should do with tags. Namely, you should use them subversively for your own purpose. If you're going to use a tag, then misunderstand it, or redirect it towards your own purposes, so that that's actually not two different inconsistencies or tensions in Kant, but a mark of his cleverness as a writer. And then in your text 7a, the quotation from Yodes at the beginning of the letter to Kant, you take it that the boy is Kant. I've always taken it that the boy is one of the boys who's supposed to learn physics.
Oh, nice.
And that what he's saying, he's feeling sorry for these kids that are going to be the objects of Kant's pedagogy and are being drawn down into the Charybdis of natural philosophy and the real world, instead of being brought up to the better flame of theology.
Ah, nice. I mean, I'll answer that one first because it's so intriguing. That didn't cross my mind. It's perfect. I think for Hamann, certainly both can be allowed. I mean, Hamann, his citational practice invites multiple interpretations. I mean, just the way he uses it with the brevity and the lack of explication, I think invites this kind of thing. And I think certainly, as the letter proceeds, and he's encouraging Kant to become a child in order to teach children, it makes perfect sense that the two, the addressee and the addresser would be conflated in this way. So that makes perfect sense to me, and I like that very much. Thank you. And the first point that you made, I tried to make the same. I said, this, on the one hand, we could think of this as ironic or contradictory or self-undermining, and yet I said that Kant doesn't really care. He's caring about his own thought, and he wants to redirect it and repurpose it accordingly. Maybe I should have made it more explicit, but I perfectly agree with you. I mean, that's why I call what Kant is doing a repetitio sententiae, that it's in the realm of ideas, and he could use his language for ideas that are redirected or repurposed according to his own Enlightenment project. So you're right. I mean, just the very fact that he ignores the provenance proves his point for independence and Mündigkeit. I fully agree. But thank you. Great. David.
I'm hesitating to ask, but I don't think I can drop question. But let me give it a try to see if I can invite you to reflect on something. I'm really trying to reflect on the nature of the juxtaposition that you've given us between Kant and Hamann and their quite different practices, citation, and then grounding that on the one hand, I would say, in the philosophical views of Kant, and on the other hand, in the Christian view of Hamann. And I wonder if you could think about that from the point of view of what we might call first person. By first person, I mean first personal. I.
Okay.
I mean my use of something. Dich deines eigenen Verstandes zu bedienen. That's the point of the whole thing, is that I must appropriate reasoning myself, for myself. I must be the one who does it. And I must take the burden of judging onto myself. I must do that first personally. I can't delegate it outside. And the thing is that just doesn't come naturally when you get a little bit of understanding. You get up there to where most is, it just falls into place. No, it takes a step that involves courage.
That's right.
Right? So there is a highlight in there of the first person. And we might say that what that is saying is that thought is of the nature to be grounded in the first person. And that is indeed the foundation of idealism for which Kant is the foundational thinker.
Right.
There's no question about that. The interesting thing about Hamann is that he imagines language, as it were, as operating independently of the first person. It reminds me very much of Heidegger. Heidegger says, you know, we must listen to what language says, not what Hamilton says,
Right, yeah.
but what language says.
Sure.
Well,
Die Sprache
natural
spricht.
answer would be, what? There's meaning something
Right.
there, but no, you're listening to that. It strikes me that there are two attitudes here. One we might call the attitude of the first personal speaker, and that's the way of appropriating.
Right.
And another we might say is the attitude of the listener, the one who must receive that language, and that, in a certain sense, is the what should I say? The juxtaposition, the polarity. I use a Goethean term called the polarity.
Yeah.
You've elaborated for us. A polarity that probably reaches beyond these two thinkers to a number of others. It's a kind of fundamental difference.
No, I think that's fantastic, very clear, and you could see how readily Hamann serves as a model for Novalis, and I think of the monologue as well, where language plays with us. And we believe we could be first-person directors of language, and yet where languages play things. I think that makes perfect sense to me, and certainly Hamann has an incredible, consistently emphasizes listening, and so even the distinction between mouth and ear, I think, is very much at work here in this distinction. I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, at the University of Chicago, we have a kind of Straussian inheritance with the distinction between philosophy, which thinks itself and thinks its own ground, and revelation,
Right.
which must receive it. It seems to me that we're in this ballpark.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, and Hamann's reception speaks to this. I think you see a lot. I mean, via Herder, who worked so close. I mean, Herder is a great figure, of course, because he studied with Kant by day and stayed with Hamann by night with strong tea. And so Herder is really the child of both. And the way Herder, sort of moves into, the foundation of the Sturm und Drang and so on. And so you could see a very good genealogy at work here in precisely this polarity that you outlined. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
You mostly talk about citations under the sort of rubric of like appropriation. And at one moment you used the language of harvesting too. I don't know whether that was your language, but I mean that seems to kind of move the kind of presence of other people's language into a different way of availability. Terms of sort of, the rightness, the beneficence, the kind of givingness of the past. And I wonder, is that just a kind of, is that there? And how does that work?
When I mentioned harvesting in passing, I was trying to allude to the many metaphors that are applied in speaking about citational practice, and harvesting is one of them. But I didn't pursue it, and I think each of these metaphors contains or implies a different citational practice, and
it also a different kind of sort of modality of availability in the cited thing itself. Sapa out is in a way right. I mean that's kind of in the Horace text it's ready to kind of offer itself up and be taken, whereas the Puer fragment isn't. Right? I mean that seems kind of much more like this.
you really have to grab it.
Yeah, it's really long.
Right. Horace gives us a sententia. He says, "Here, use it. I'm giving it. This is a gift for you, and you can reapply it." And it's exactly how. And Horace himself, as I tried to show, the opening of that line, the Dimidium line, is already Horace. So he's citing an adage and then gives us an adage for posterity. So he obviously is trying to think in terms of this type of language, this laconic sense. Oh, okay. So, yes.
One thing that struck me is that in your wonderful
analysis of sententiousness. We sort of zoomed in on the, in some sense, poetic literary side of it. Mm-hmm. And obviously that was one of the thrusts to constellate Kant and Horace. But of course there's also a very, very strong philosophical tradition of sententiousness. And we're so to say, sentences that are used within for another kind of appropriation. Mm-hmm. So I just wonder how would that change, and of course the interesting thing about Kant and the Aufklärung's essay is that suddenly it gets introduced into a mode of philosophy that tries to break with that kind of ancient mode of philosophy, using sentences or apothegmata to, appropriate something for oneself. And in that sense, actually,
this first personal,
the problem of making an abstract truth your own, to subjectify it. Mm-hmm. And the question then, of course, would be how a Christian adaptation of that sententiousness, which of course happened in early monasticism, how that changes things, and how then possibly Hamann is actually exploiting precisely that and is playing off another form of sententiousness, of performativity, of those precisely short
that you see as continuous with scholasticism?
I haven't thought about it through Hamann, but it seems to me that one of the interesting things about Kant is precisely, as you showed now, using a different set of reference points, how sort of schizophrenic Kant is in his attempt to ground a new philosophy, a new mode of thinking, and yet he uses these sort of tools from the regime he's trying to overcome.
But I think this is where David Welber's sort of description fits perfectly as an explication, because essentially Kant is philosophizing with a theory of language, an implicit theory of language that is vastly different from Hamann's implicit theory of language. And I think that goes a long way in explaining what is taking place here. And Hamann could be seen as sort of old guard or even reactionary. This whole project was really Kant and Behrens, who was Hamann's employer, who, Hamann goes off on this mercantile mission in London. He fails. He fails to. It's very vague. He was supposed to maybe get a contract signed. He never shows back up in Königsberg. He's there for 2 years, and when he comes back, he tells his friends that he just read the Bible, 4 times through from beginning to end, and he had this incredible conversion. Prior to that, Hamann was a champion of the Enlightenment, and so Kant and Behrens are sort of trying to figure out the best way to win Hamann back. So there is a reactionary sense as well. But I think it's the repeated allusion to the incarnation, which does not, and Hamann's anti-Docetism. You can't think of Christ's flesh as simply a disguise that contains a divine God within that is detachable from the flesh, right? Just like you can't think of a word as a kind of material container for immaterial sense. And so that's why Hamann is, and this is why Heidegger and Benjamin are going to constantly allude to Hamann. And Benjamin, in his famous essay on language, of course, cites Hamann to precisely this end, where the famous distinction between mere word and name, where name for Benjamin is this non-detachability of signifier and signified. But yes, I'm sorry. And then and then Shabi.
Oh, okay. Well, on sententiousness.
Okay.
I was very intrigued by your citation of the Pythagoras passage.
Okay.
And I was wondering how much irony you are going to assign to attribute to Socrates.
You think Socrates is ironic?
Well, whenever there's whenever there is somebody launches the sententious saying, a short, brief saying, hey, that's, okay, you can see yourself as diminished by that, like a child or whatever, but Socrates is not diminished.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
Okay.
And in fact, elsewhere, as you know,
Right. So this is the challenge, for him, probe the
Right. I mean,
these Lacedaemonians are dumb, okay?
Right.
They don't know. They're not able to really to pursue the thought that they are hurling forth in order to raise raise themselves up as an authority.
No, Socrates'
method.
His method is explicitly against this.
Think of system.
Right.
He doesn't really know what he's talking about, but he has those Lacedaemonians. And so there's nothing in their mind for him to do.
And in fact, Socrates elsewhere explicitly says, this is the wrong way to philosophize. Just shooting your opponent down with the great apothem. But you can't diminish the role that know thyself plays, the Gnothosoton plays in the Socratic. I mean, of course, with great irony again, but Socrates is anything but. His method is anything but propaganda. Yeah.
And there's a whole dialogue on know thyself.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So I absolutely agree. And I wanted to. I basically adduced. I called Plato to witness here. In order to show the attraction of the short, concise dictum, the Lacedaemonianism, that it exists as a topic, that this was actually current, together with the Aristotle. People found this to be impressive, and of course Socrates doesn't.
Well, yeah, it's kind of a red flag.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you.
John, I was wondering if you thought about contextualizing this Kantian use of Senteniarum within the history of philosophical caution about just how a quoted maxim or a quoted line of verse has the powerful effect that it has, why it's so persuasive and effective. And there's a famous letter of Seneca's 108, and where Terentius in the Protagoras, he compares the effect of quoting a line of poetry in philosophical discourse to hurling a weapon at somebody, because it strikes them so much more powerfully and effectively than it would if you had made a prosaic explanation in logical terms of why your point was a good one.
Right.
So on the one hand, there's this acknowledgement within the philosophical, or at least the Stoic tradition, that skilling a line of verse and using it can have a massive impact on a listener. But on the other hand, there's a lot of anxiety about just how that happens. What emotive springs are being touched within the hearer? What non-rational activity is going on in that soul when these weapon-like words are heard? And I'm wondering if you so nicely situated the question of wisdom between morals and philosophizing in your discussion of this passage. I'm wondering if there are two other poles to situate it within, namely between rational thought, as one might expect in an Enlightenment context, and the appeal of the emotional line of verse.
Right.
The emotional appeal of the line of verse.
That's wonderful. I mean, in a sense, if citation is citation of an authority, it wins the argument because the authority is adduced, and it's almost as if in the contract between the interlocutors, you can't argue against the authority. Once the authority comes in, it ends the game. And I could imagine that this would be at least the appeal until you start, like Kant, like Socrates, question the authoritativeness of the authority. The emotional appeal of it, that's difficult. I mean, I don't know if I could figure out why the sententious remark would have this kind of impact.
The verse especially.
And verse especially.
The meter has something to do.
Right.
The meters are kind of conveyance into the soul.
I mean, is it because it's a kind of language that's cordoned off from mere communicative discourse? Is it quasi-sacred in that sense, that it has a formulaic or a type of resonance that marks off this use of language from other uses, more commodified uses or communicative usages? I mean, it could be. Yeah. But wonderful to think about. Thank you. Hi, Michele.
I'm wondering if you could say just a little more about the figure of the child.
Okay.
Because the child keeps coming relationship of the child to speech, because it seems that in the Kant passages, the children they have this Unmündigkeit,
right.
they can't even speak for themselves
right.
in the least. Whereas in the Protagoras, the child may not be very good at speech, but at least is in a certain way on its way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that it's not a speechless child, but maybe a child reduced to silence by the situation.
Or the speaker reduced to a silent child.
To a silent child,
right.
the
right.
figure of the child.
Right.
But then when you came to the Hamann letter, you emphasized that the children are speaking there.
Right.
And I'm just wondering how far you would push that contrast between these unspeaking Kantian children and the speaking Hamann children, particularly in light of the fact that Kant goes on and keeps in the places that you've selected, emphasize that a great part of mankind, including the fair sex, and a large portion of mankind seem also to be entirely lacking in Monday.
Right.
Are they speechless, or are they?
They rather not speak for them. They'd rather not take responsibility. They don't want to adopt this first personal position. They find it to be dangerous, something that they have to be guarded. They guard themselves from that. They prefer to have the authoritative institutions like the church, like the state, and so forth, to speak in their stead, to be their Vormund, to their mouth would stand in front of their own mouths, which are closed. Hamann, however, is entirely orthodox here theologically, that the children, that Christianity is a certain kind of childishness, that it's in the foolishness of the Christian gospel, in the childlikeness of it, and also in the innocence of it, that Hamann is privileging here. And so for him, Kant, reducing himself to become a child, to speak like a child, to not only admit that children have mouths, but to actually make his own mouth childlike, is analogous to the condescension, the divine condescension, the God becoming human, this act of humility or making one humble. So I think in that sense, again, we're dealing with a different, kind of different theory of language implicitly, and I think that for me is figures around these various assessments of what childlikeness in fact entails. Yeah, David.
I'm wondering if you would accept an emendation to your reading of Hamann in the following terms. Your reading of Hamann is a reading of Hamann as a convinced Christian, as one who's filled with the truth of the Christian revelation, and that's undoubtedly true. But I'm struck by the remark from Hegel's review, which I regard as truly a great piece of literary criticism. When Hegel says that everything is style, what he means is that it's style all the way down. There's no content. There's no concept. There's nothing that can be peeled off and made transportable. It's style all the way down. The style definition here is the style. Style is the man. Style is the individuation. And in a certain sense, what Hamann did was to create a body of work. It's about that big, a bookshelf, create a body of work that is radically untranslatable because it is so absolutely singular.
Right.
It is a writing that resists any uptake, that resists any Aufhebung, that resists anything but a reading of that writing. And in that sense, it strikes me as a kind of modernist, as a sort of proto-modernist project.
Right.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
You see him as a kind of...
where form is the content.
Where the water is, goes two ways.
Sure.
It goes back and goes forward. It's a sort of... He's a sort of Celan avant-productor, another admirer.
Right.
Would you buy that?
Absolutely. I think Hamann's theory of language would prove to be sort of the current theory of language for European modernism. I think that makes perfect sense. And even, you think of something, say, from Adorno, where, form is sedimented content. And the whole notion of form as content, or where form becomes content, or where the distinction between form and content no longer makes any sense, or no longer has any value at all. And it is absolutely true on a completely practical level that, translating the letters are hard enough, but translating some of the essays where he's really going all out, making it almost entirely impossible to translate a line properly, which is why I think he's perfectly fine with having his allusions mean more than three things simultaneously. Yes?
Maybe to follow up on that, I'm not sure if in 7C you italicized things because they are emphasized as the original.
They are.
Okay. But do you want to say a little bit about what you think is behind the Raube Guter Fehler?
I think it's a biblical allusion. I couldn't find it, but I think it has to do with maybe alluding to a certain kind of citational practice that is really simply robbing these colored feathers and using classical learning as mere ornamentation. You can't become a child simply. You can't become this effective speaker. You can't become a speaker of the word if you're simply dealing with language as stealing these colored feathers for the sake of ornamentation, for the sake of prettifying your discourse. You have to believe in the indispensability of the word itself.
Is it also a kind of high church thing to be dressed up and on the pulpit and sing?
For high mass, are colored feathers worn?
That kind of sense, is it that kind of authority that you should not be?
Sure. It may in fact allude to Hamann's depiction of Kant as being in a position of superiority that he has to then subsequently renounce, right? To relinquish one's superiority. It may be connected with that. But I think the idea is that, the idea of colored feathers strikes me as alluding to a certain kind of ornamentational sense, where words are simply ornaments for ideas or dressing up your ideas. So, and it's again very, very modernist, right? This is the famous anecdote, one that immediately comes to mind, is when Degas runs into Mallarmé on the streets and says, Stéphane, I have these great ideas for poems, but I can't seem to write any of them. And then Mallarmé says, my dear Degas, you don't write poems with ideas, you write them with words, right? And you can't, and so if you just have all of these sort of colored feathers that are trying to ornament ideas, you're on the wrong path, according to Hamann's implicit linguistic theory. Jörg. Oh, sorry.
No, it was just
a follow-up?
Addendum, because you surely know it's a German colloquialism. They say,
oh, okay.
And I don't know where that comes from. When we have to look it up.
Right.
He's clearly playing Aiden's art.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Perfect.
I want to follow on to the proto-modernist Hamann, so to speak, and previous ones often accused that he is the death of the author. And because the last Hamann quote, and I'm trying to read this several times, and ends with 3 death sentences.
Right. Well, no, because Louis XV was not assassinated. It was a failed attempt. Oh, but the execution of the right, the would-be assassin, right? Daniel, right? Okay.
Sentences, so to speak. So we could, with this idea in mind, whether we can connect these. Why is this the death, so to speak, so prominent? And this is the final sentences of this essay, the death of.
That's great.
Speaker, so to speak, of one who uses these words.
Mm. Why is he? I mean, this is beautiful, right? Why is he killing off these sovereign figures? Not. I mean, I don't know. The difficult part is the assassin. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, the crucifixion, of course, is sort of the high point of the condescension, right? Because and it's interesting, right? Because at that moment, Christ himself is going to cite the prophets, right? In Aramaic, right? Was it Eli Eli? I'll look at Adam. Eli Eli sabachthani. My Aramaic is really shaky. My God, why have you forsaken me? So he cites. So the last moment on the crucifix. Well, actually, then he says one more thing, right? He says dipso, right? I thirst. But basically, the idea of the crucifixion as the absolute high point of complete depletion. That at this moment he is all mortal, all flesh, no trace of the divine whatsoever. Would these death sentences mark a certain kind of utter depletion of that ideational content that we rely on for how we understand language, that we're left with the flesh of the words themselves? I'm improvising here, but I think it's a great thing to think further about, because it is the very ending of the essay. It's absolute end. And that he kills off this series is very, very intriguing. Yeah. Oh, Shadi, do you know?
No,
oh, okay.
The much more mundane thing, the stealing the colored feathers.
Okay.
Aesopian fable. It's also in the Fabulous Figures, and it's about a jackdaw who sees some peacocks.
Kafka in Czech, right? The jackdaw.
He steals the feathers of one of the peacocks, puts them on, and goes strutting around with the peacocks, claiming to be a peacock. An imposter, and they murder him.
Wow, it's fantastic. This is what you do. You give a talk on Hamann, and you discover all of the illusions that he was just. That's fantastic. Thank you. It's wonderful.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, Kate.
And maybe this is a somewhat muddled question, but I was curious, it seems as though there's a slight difference between the kind of citation that you give in the final passage from Hamann and the sorts of citations that you speak about in the other portions of the essay, which are direct quotations from texts.
Right.
Whereas in the final passage, these are sort of quotations from life, or let's say, or quotations from prior knowledge that draw upon and naturally other sorts of citations also draw upon prior knowledge,
right?
But they don't impose a context or a specific portion of the text of Horace or a specific portion of, say, the story of Socrates' death on the reader. And instead, coming there at the very end of the essay, seem to be inviting somebody to pull out and expand sort of their own patent knowledge of what's occurring. I'm curious as to whether you see what's happening in this final example that you offered as precisely the same sort of citation, the same sort of appeal to authority, non-appeal to authority that you describe in the previous examples, or whether you see these as two sort of differing varieties of the same draw.
Right. I guess the distinction is between citation and allusion, and both, of course, Hamann. I mean, every sentence he writes is either citing or alluding. So this is his mode, obviously. If his practice of allusion is analogous to his practice of citation, then one would suspect that the allusion is meant to invite the reader to, reach for the prior text. The whole point then would be, it's how we understand. The difference between, like I said, Kant does not want you to put down the essay Was ist Aufklärung and go get Horace's epistles. But he's using Horace so that he's repurposing it. He's allowing the effective quality of the verse Sape Aude to give value, to give pertinence to his writing. But you're basically supposed to stay with the text. Hamann, on the contrary, is constantly asking you to put the text down and go to another text. And I think in that sense, his allusion practices are very analogous with his citational practices. However, when one does an allusion, you're not dealing with the same indispensable materiality of the letter. So it makes it more complicated. And so one would have to think through how the practice of illusion almost seems to undercut his otherwise insistent sort of devotion to the materiality of the signifier. And that would be something I would have to think further on. But thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think it's interesting what you were saying and what Kate was getting at in light of your citation from Aristotle's Metaphysics in item 4. He outlines 3 separate ways of speaking. Like one is mathematikos, and then one is paradigmatikos, and the other is to use the poet as a
martyrs.
Witness. But it seems like the paradigmatikos is what he's doing here, right? Which is
so that would be the illustrative example.
It's the illustrative example, which is somewhere between this complete abstraction of mathematics and the poet's witnessing. Somehow the paradigmatikos, which is the historical illusions, or the things that you're calling illusions here, mediates between the purely creational and then the purely
so we have
embodied word.
That's wonderful.
I don't know if that's useful.
Excellent.
I come from a very different perspective, but I was very pleased because quotation, citation interests me a lot. Working on the essay recently, I come from a very different, but the essay deals a lot with quotation and reappropriation of cultural artifacts and to recontextualize them, etc. And so this opposition between the use in Kant is, let's say, to nail down an idea, and in Hamann, it seemed, but I was curious to know how much freedom is given to the reader to participate in his journey and to make this opposition between a treatise and an essay, also in the sense that Adorno is defining that.
Okay.
So is Hamann also giving expression to this mental journey in a way that the reader is invited to follow, but also to break off and take his own journeys, or is he somehow bound to Hamann's development?
I would have to say, I mean, it deserves thinking more carefully, but I would have to say that Kant is encouraging the independent reader more so than Hamann. That Hamann's text, in its elusiveness, in its citations, in the fact that you can't simply sit down and read it, that you have to work with it and figure it out, and there are enigmas to be solved. There are enigmas that cannot be solved. There are limits to our comprehensibility. Oedipus solves the riddle, but of course he doesn't solve the riddle, right? There's always, even those who solve things have to figure out other consequences for their solutions. And the fact that Hamann stages all of this repeatedly seems to suggest that he binds the reader to the letter in a way that Kant would find scandalous.
On the other hand, it seems to be an active reader in another sense, very active in the way that you say you have to go through and make it your own, so it's not laid out for you.
Yeah, I don't know. Active, passive-aggressive, I don't know, something along these lines. Right, but it's curious. The position of the reader, how Hamann's implicit reader or implied reader, when we used to talk about implied readers, would be a very difficult figure to draw, I think. Yeah. But thank you.
Anyone else? No? Well, yeah. Almost okay. Mark.
I've been chewing over this passage quintillions he has in number 2.
Okay. So this is the last. You're good. This is the one that we didn't discuss yet. So we have full comprehensive.
And in part because I've been trying to measure. We've been saying about Kant and Hamann by this perspective, right? Which you were bringing out the way that there's a tradition of Sententiae from the poets being authoritative. But it's interesting to me that this is a very rhetorical way of thinking about it, right? It's asking, it's either a pragmatic or, if you're that cynical approach to authority, right? Like, so who would you listen to? Who could I quote that would have an influence on you, right? And the Aristotle passage brings out that even more so, where he's aware that some people will listen to this and some people will listen to something else.
Right.
And so there's this emphasis on making the choice of what's going to seem authoritative and be persuasive. And that seems to me to, after thinking about it, the Kant passage, that seems to fit pretty well. And I'm wondering if that next to the Hamann, right, is this a way of thinking about what Hamann's doing to say that he's trying to undermine that approach? In that when he quotes, first he's not putting himself in a place of choosing the authorities. He's sort of receiving the authorities. And then more so, when he does the sapere aude, it's the opposite effect of Kant's, right? So for Kant, this is meant to be persuasive. This is meant to be authoritative, using it in his own way.
Right.
But here, it's meant to be a slap in the face, right? Like this is
Vale sapere aude, right?
Yeah, right. In a way that's meant to offend rather than persuade. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, or.
I don't know about the rhetorical situation, because, I mean, it's useful. This might come back to something Shadi mentioned, because generally one likes to distinguish between pathos and ethos. I mean, pathos would be how you affect the emotions of your audience, but you do that by developing the ethos of the speaker as well. So I have to basically not only I persuade you by presenting myself as a trustworthy character. And the poets that I choose to cite would, of course, give you a clue as you know, what my ethical character, in fact, is like. And if you accept as authoritative the poets that I choose to cite, then you will be more likely to think of me as an ethical speaker. And when you think that I'm ethical, that I'm trustworthy, you'll be persuaded. I don't know if Kant cares so much about that. Hamann seems to care about it, but the idea is that the ethos that he's cultivating is a theological program, and he's basically deferring to that. So it's not only that kind of pathetic influence, but also the kind of trying to establish this kind of ethical power that could therefore be more persuasive because it's more trustworthy. I don't read his conclusion to the letter as offending Kant. I think he's playing with sapere, which is such a curious verb. I mean, it's like taste, right? Sabor. I mean, it's a tasting, it's a sensing. And yet it's also, of course, cognate with sophos and sophia and all these wisdom words that he wants to focus on. That's why I made the joke about savoring what others find insipid and so forth. That he's very, very cognizant, I think, of this, and more mouths to be had with the tasting metaphors. But I think he quotes this line from Horace, the sapere aude, in order to dare for sapientia, that is sapientius, that is more wise than your wisdom, right? Dare to go beyond your rationality, dare to move past that, dare to relinquish your superiority so that you could be more superior and so forth. I think that's more of Hamann's direction in that conclusion, but thank you.
I can also ask I was wondering what you see, what the role of Zeugen.
I'm sorry, the role?
Zeugen.
Mm-hmm.
Giving testimony.
Giving testimony, bearing witness.
Given the fact that Hamann's ending talks about dass die Wahrheit zeugen möchte, and then talks about, of course, the different form of martyrdom, of martyrs, in regard to Blutzeugen. And in German, there is you talk about einen Zeugen herbeizitieren. So citationality, of course, is just coming from the Greek. Aristotle, of course, takes this up,
right.
And the German. So the question would be, is actually citation just a subservient to Zeugnis? And possibly would Hamann then be, who's trying to restore that theological Zeugenschaft, and as you probably know, being schooled in a Catholic school, Zeugnis is, in some sense, the central speech act of the New Testament. That's what
bearing witness,
is about.
Sure.
And the question then would be whether that's one way to think about Kant versus another way to think about Kant versus Hamann.
That Kant is doing what?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I would have to. I haven't figured that out yet.
I see. I see.
My question.
Right.
I think it's clear that in Hamann, the Zeugnis is central, and that might be also be one way to think about his theory of language.
Right. Well, there's also the productivity implicit in Zeugen, right? To add Zeugen and so forth, and I mean it's the testicle and testimony, right? The testis as the kind of generative, engendering issues of bearing witness that also have a huge importance for Luther and the Reformation and so forth. What's interesting, I think, in this regard is Hamann. Hamann is often cited for his really radical sexual explicitness as well, and this is something that he brings up again and again. And I think it has to do with this general idea of witnessing as also engendering, as also is testiculating a verb? I can make it up. Okay, good. I just made up a new word. But I think I would go along these lines. Celan's wonderfully haunting line, "Niemand zeugt für den Zeugen," right? No one bears witness for the witness.
If we judge events not just by the quality of the talk itself, but by the response it engenders, I think we all deserve to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.